The locks were changed before my father's body was even cold in the ground. I stood on the porch of the Victorian house I had spent 32 years calling home, my key turning uselessly in the deadbolt, while my older sister, Sloane Vance, watched me through the frosted glass of the front door. She didn't open it. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She simply closed the silk curtains, leaving me standing in the pouring rain with nothing but my school bag and a single box of my father's old journals. My name is Cassidy Elena Vance, and for my entire life, I believed that blood was thicker than greed. I was wrong. That morning, at the reading of my father Arthur Vance's will, I watched Sloane smirk as a lawyer, one I had never seen before, read a document that effectively erased me and our younger brother, Marcus, from the family history. To my eldest daughter, Sloane, I leave the estate, the antique restoration business, and all liquid assets, the lawyer had droned. I remember looking at Marcus, who was only 24 and still struggling to find his footing, and seeing the same devastating confusion in his eyes that I felt in my soul. My father was a man of fairness, a man who had spent every Sunday of my childhood telling us that his greatest legacy was our unity. But as I stood on that porch, dripping wet and locked out of my own life, the man I thought I knew felt like a stranger, and the sister I grew up with felt like an enemy. But let me back up, because to understand how a woman like Sloane could strip her own siblings of their inheritance, you have to understand the 3 months leading up to Arthur Vance's final breath. My father was a craftsman, a master of wood and history. He ran Vance and Sons Restoration, though I was the one who spent every weekend there, helping him catalog period-accurate hardware and teaching me the chemistry behind 19th-century varnishes. Sloane? She hated the sawdust. She hated the grime. She moved to the city the moment she turned 18 and only returned when her high-fashion lifestyle outpaced her credit limit. Yet, when Dad fell ill with a sudden, aggressive form of pneumonia that weakened his heart, Sloane moved back into the manor like a vulture circling a fallen stag. I was the one balancing my teaching job at the high school with overnight shifts at his bedside. I was the one who knew which medications made him nauseous and which stories made him smile. Sloane, however, was the one who took over his administrative affairs. She told me she was helping him organize his papers so I could focus on his health. "You're so stressed, Cassidy," she had told me, her voice dripping with a fake, honeyed concern. "Let me handle the boring legal stuff. You just be his daughter." I trusted her. It's the greatest mistake of my life. The day of the funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and shallow condolences. Marcus was a wreck, leaning on me for support, while Sloane stood at the head of the casket like she was already presiding over a kingdom. She didn't cry. She just watched the mourners, calculating their net worth by the brands of their coats. 2 hours after we laid him to rest, we were summoned to the office of a man named Mr. Sterling, not Julian Thorne, the lawyer who had represented my father for 40 years. Sloane claimed Julian had retired and that Dad had wanted a fresh set of eyes on his estate. That should have been my first warning. When the will was read, and the house, the business, and the 7-figure life insurance policy all went to Sloane, I felt the air leave my lungs. Marcus tried to protest, his voice cracking as he asked about the college fund Dad had promised him for his master's degree. Sloane didn't even look at him. She just tapped her manicured nails on the mahogany table and said, "Dad felt you both lacked the discipline to manage such responsibility. He entrusted it to me to oversee." Oversee was a lie. Within 48 hours, she had served me with an informal eviction notice, claiming she needed to renovate the property for sale. For the next 2 weeks, I lived out of a motel that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. My salary as a science teacher was enough to get by, but not enough to hire a high-powered attorney to contest a signed and notarized will. I watched from afar as Sloane began to dismantle Arthur Vance's life. She put the antique restoration shop up for auction, a business that had been in our family for 3 generations. She sold Dad's 1967 Jaguar, the car he and I had spent 4 years restoring together in the garage. Every time I saw a new sold post on her social media, it felt like she was erasing a piece of my heart. Marcus called me every night, crying because he had to drop out of his semester since his tuition check had bounced. Sloane had frozen the joint accounts Dad used for our family expenses. She was liquidating, she said. She was simplifying. In reality, she was burning the bridge we all stood on and kept the only life raft for herself. I tried to call Julian Thorne, the old family lawyer, but his office told me he was away on an extended sabbatical and wasn't taking calls. It seemed like every door was slamming in my face. I spent my evenings grading papers in that dim motel room, the flickering fluorescent light reflecting the tears I refused to let fall. I felt like I had failed my father. I had let his legacy be butchered by the most selfish person I knew. I had no evidence of foul play, only a gut feeling that Arthur Vance would never have left Marcus with nothing. But a gut feeling doesn't hold up in probate court. I was ready to give up. I was looking at studio apartments in the bad part of town, wondering how I would explain to Marcus that the future our father promised us was gone. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was in the middle of a chemistry lab with my juniors, my phone buzzed incessantly in my pocket. I ignored it until the third call from an unknown number with a prestigious area code. I stepped into the hallway, my heart racing for a reason I couldn't explain. "Hello?" I said, my voice tight. "Is this Cassidy Elena Vance?" the voice on the other end asked. It was deep, professional, and carried a weight of authority that made me stand up straighter. "Yes, this is she." "My name is Julian Thorne," the man said, and I nearly dropped the phone. "I've just returned to the country, and I've been informed of your father's passing. More importantly, I've been informed of the will that was processed in my absence." My breath hitched. "Mr. Thorne, Sloane said you retired." She said Dad changed everything. There was a long, cold silence on the other end. "I did not retire, Cassidy. And your father did not change his will through my office. I need you to come to my private chambers in Raleigh immediately. Do not tell your sister. Do not tell your brother. Just come." I drove 3 hours in a daze, the speedometer climbing as I raced toward a hope I was terrified to trust. Julian Thorne's office was not in a glass skyscraper like Mr. Sterling's. It was in a quiet, ivy-covered brick building that felt like it held 1,000 secrets. When I walked in, Julian was standing behind a massive oak desk, looking exactly as I remembered him, sharp eyes, silver hair, and a sense of integrity that radiated off him. He didn't offer me coffee or small talk. He looked at me and placed a heavy, thick envelope on the desk. It was cream-colored, sealed with red wax, a seal I recognized instantly. It was my father's signet ring, the one he wore every single day. "Your father came to me 6 months ago," Julian said softly. "He was a smart man, Cassidy. He knew his health was failing, and he knew exactly what kind of woman Sloane was becoming. He knew she might try something if he wasn't there to stop her." My hand shook as I reached for the envelope. "What is this?" I whispered. Julian leaned forward, his expression grim. "That is the sealed envelope. Your father gave it to me with very specific instructions. He said that if he were to pass, and if you ever found yourself standing outside that house with nowhere to go, I was to give this to you." I looked at the red wax, the imprint of the Vance family crest staring back at me. "Sloane already took everything, Mr. Thorne. The house, the business, the money, it's all gone." Julian smiled then, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who was about to spring a trap. "Cassidy, your sister took what she thought was everything. She played a game of checkers, but your father? He was a grandmaster at chess. Open the envelope." I broke the seal, the wax cracking like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside, there wasn't a new will. There wasn't a check. Instead, there was a single brass key with a leather tag, a set of GPS coordinates written in my father's precise, architectural script, and a handwritten letter that began with words that made my heart stop. Cassidy, if you are reading this, then Sloane has done exactly what I feared. She has chosen the shadow over the light. But what she doesn't know is that the most valuable thing I owned was never kept in a bank account or a deed. I looked at Julian, my eyes wide. What does this mean? Where does this key go? Julian picked up his briefcase and straightened his tie. That key doesn't open a door, Cassidy. It opens a revelation. And if we hurry, we can get to the storage facility before your sister's auctioneers arrive at the shop to start selling off the equipment. My mind was spinning. The auction was set for tomorrow morning. Sloane was planning to sell the very foundation of my father's life to the highest bidder, and I was holding a key to a secret she didn't even know existed. "We have to go," I said, the teacher in me replaced by a fire I hadn't felt since the funeral. "We have to go right now." As we walked to the car, Julian looked at the coordinates and then at me. "Your father knew you'd be the one to fight for him, Cassidy. Now, let's go see what he really left you." We pulled out of the parking lot, the sun setting behind us, as I realized the battle for the Vance legacy wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and Sloane had no idea that the everything she took was nothing compared to what was hidden in the dark. The drive to the outskirts of the city was silent. Julian Thorne drove his black sedan with a precision that matched his reputation. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the brass key so hard it left an imprint on my palm. "My father was an architect, Mr. Thorne," I said, looking out at the passing trees. "He built things to last. He used to tell me that the foundation is the most important part of any structure, because if the foundation is weak, the whole thing will eventually crumble." I thought he was talking about buildings. Now, I think he was talking about our family. Julian didn't look away from the road. "Your father was talking about both, Cassidy." Sloane forgot that. She was so focused on the roof, the prestige, the money, the visibility, that she never bothered to check the ground she was standing on. We reached a facility that looked more like an old industrial bunker than a modern storage center. It sat at the end of a long, gravel road, hidden by overgrown pines. It wasn't the kind of place a wealthy man like Arthur Vance would usually frequent. But as Julian pulled up to a heavy steel door, I realized this wasn't about status. It was about security. "Your father kept this unit under a shell company," Julian explained as we stepped out into the humid evening air. "Not even Sloane's private investigators found it. He paid the lease 20 years in advance." I walked to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I inserted the brass key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. The door creaked open, revealing a space that smelled of cedar wood, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of my father's tobacco. As I flipped the light switch, a row of industrial humming lamps flickered to life. I gasped. It wasn't a room full of gold bars or cash. It was a library of the Vance legacy. Row after row of meticulously organized flat-file cabinets, architectural models, and dozens of black leather-bound ledgers. In the center of the room sat a large drafting table, and on it, a single blue folder with my name on it. "What is all this?" I whispered, walking toward the table. Julian stayed by the door, giving me space. "This is the everything Sloane didn't get," he said. "The Vance Construction Group wasn't just a business, Cassidy. It was a collection of patents, historical restoration techniques, and more importantly, the land deeds to property your father bought in the 70s and 80s. Properties he never developed. Properties that are currently sitting in the middle of what is now the most expensive real estate district in the state." I opened the blue folder. Inside was a document that made my knees weak. It was a deed of transfer, dated 3 months before my father died. It transferred the ownership of the land underneath the Vance family estate, the very house Sloane had kicked me out of, to a private trust. I looked up at Julian, confused. "But Sloane has the deed to the house." I saw it. "It's in her name." Julian walked over and pointed to a specific paragraph in the document. "She has the deed to the structure, Cassidy. Your father performed a very rare, very legal maneuver. He separated the ownership of the building from the ownership of the land it sits on. Sloane owns the bricks and the mortar. But you own the dirt. And according to the terms of this trust, the owner of the land has the right to demand the removal of any temporary structures with 30 days' notice." A cold, sharp realization washed over me. Sloane thought she was the queen of the castle, but I held the ground she was standing on. She couldn't sell the house, she couldn't renovate it, and she certainly couldn't live in it if I decided she shouldn't. But my father hadn't just left me leverage, he had left me a message. Underneath the deed was a photograph of the three of us when we were children: Sloane, myself, and our younger brother, Marcus. We were sitting in the garden, covered in dirt, laughing. "Where is Marcus?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I haven't heard from him since the funeral. Sloane told me he went to Europe to clear his head." Julian's expression darkened. "Marcus didn't go to Europe, Cassidy. Sloane has him tucked away in a private rehabilitation facility 2 towns over. She's been using his inheritance to pay for it, telling him that you were the one who wanted him committed. She's been isolating him so he won't side with you." The fire in my chest intensified. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about my brother. Sloane hadn't just stolen my home, she had kidnapped our family's future and turned us against each other. "We need to get to the shop," I said, my voice hardening. "The auction starts at 8 a.m. tomorrow. If she sells those machines, she destroys the business's ability to operate, regardless of who owns the land." Julian checked his watch. "Then we don't have much time. But there's one more thing in that folder you need to see." I turned the page. It was a series of bank statements from the Vance Construction Group's main account. Over the last 2 years, millions of dollars had been funneled out into an offshore account. The signatures on the transfers weren't my father's. They were Sloane's. She had been embezzling from the company while our father was still alive, while he was dying in that hospital bed. She didn't just take what was left, I whispered, the horror of it sinking in. She was stealing it from him while he was breathing. Julian nodded. He knew. He discovered it right before the end. That's why he came to me. He didn't want to see his daughter in prison, but he also couldn't let her destroy you. He gave her a choice in his will, to be fair, but he knew her well enough to know she wouldn't take it. He built this vault as your armor. I grabbed the folder and the black ledgers. "Let's go. I'm done being the quiet science teacher who lets everyone walk over her. It's time for a chemistry lesson. And the first thing we're going to study is a volatile reaction." We arrived at the Vance Construction headquarters just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The parking lot was already bustling with activity. Large trucks with auction services printed on the side were backed up to the loading docks. Men in high-visibility vests were tagging my father's heavy machinery, the excavators, the cranes, the custom-milled woodwork tools he had spent 40 years collecting. Sloane was there, standing on the loading dock like she was surveying her kingdom. She was wearing a tailored white suit, a stark contrast to the grease and dust of the yard. She held a clipboard and was barking orders at a group of movers. When she saw Julian's car pull up, she didn't even flinch. She just smirked, checked her diamond-encrusted watch, and walked down the ramp to meet us. "Cassidy," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I told you not to come here. It's only going to make it harder for you to watch. Why don't you go back to your little classroom and grade some papers? This is for people who understand how the world actually works." I stepped out of the car, the blue folder tucked under my arm. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at the crane being hooked up to a flatbed trailer. "The auction hasn't started yet, Sloane. Tell them to stop." Sloane laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. "Stop? I've already taken deposits. This equipment is worth $4 million, money that is currently being liquidated to pay off the debts our father supposedly left behind. Since I'm the sole executor of the estate, I suggest you get out of the way before I have security remove you for trespassing." I looked at Julian, who gave me a slight nod. I turned back to my sister. "I'm not trespassing, Sloane. But you might be. Do you know what a ground lease is?" Sloane's smirk flickered for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" "It's a simple concept," I said, stepping closer. "You own the company. You own the buildings. But you don't own the land. Not here, and not at the house." I held up the deed from the vault. "Dad moved the land into a trust. My trust. And as of 5 minutes ago, I am exercising my right to terminate the occupancy of the Vance Construction Group on this property. You have 30 days to move every single one of these buildings, every piece of equipment, and every ounce of gravel off my dirt. If you sell that crane today, the new owner won't be allowed to drive it across my parking lot to take it home. You're selling items that are legally trapped. The blood drained from Sloane's face. She snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. This is fake. This is a desperate lie. It's as real as the millions of dollars you stole from Dad's offshore accounts over the last 2 years, I countered, my voice rising so the movers could hear. I have the ledgers, Sloane. I have the signatures. I have the forensic audit Julian prepared. If you don't stop this auction right now, the next person I call isn't a lawyer, it's the district attorney. Sloane looked around frantically. The auctioneers had stopped working, sensing the shift in power. Her hand, the one holding the clipboard, began to shake. You think you're so smart, Cassidy. You think Dad loved you more because you were the good one? He was weak. He was sentimental. I'm the one who kept this company alive. By stealing from it? I asked. By putting Marcus in a cage so he couldn't see what you were doing. At the mention of Marcus, Sloane's eyes narrowed into slits. Marcus is where he belongs. He's a liability. No, a new voice called out from behind us. We both turned. A taxi had pulled up to the gate, and stepping out of it was a young man who looked like a ghost of our father. It was Marcus Vance. He looked thin, his hair was longer than I remembered, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on Sloane with a cold, piercing intensity. I'm not a liability, Sloane, Marcus said, walking toward us. But I am a witness. I remember the night Dad confronted you about the missing funds. I remember you telling him that if he went to the police, you'd make sure he died alone in a state-run home. I remember everything. Sloane took a step back, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. Marcus, you're confused. You've been unwell. I've been drugged, Sloane, Marcus spat, standing beside me. I reached out and took his hand, feeling his fingers tremble. Julian got me out this morning. He showed me the truth. He showed me that Cassidy didn't abandon me. You did. Julian Thorne stepped forward, his presence as imposing as a judge's verdict. Sloane Vance, as the legal counsel for Arthur Vance's private trust, I am officially freezing the assets of the Vance Construction Group pending a full investigation into embezzlement and elder abuse. Any sale of equipment today will be considered a criminal act of conversion. Sloane looked at the workers, then at the auctioneers, and finally at me. The white suit she was so proud of seemed to sag on her shoulders. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would break my toys just to see me cry. But I wasn't a little girl anymore. I was a Vance, and I had my father's iron in my blood. The game is over, Sloane, I said quietly. Get your things out of my house. And get your hands off our father's legacy. Sloane didn't move. She stared at us, her chest heaving, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. You think you've won? You think a few papers change the fact that I've been running this city for years? I have friends, Cassidy. High-placed friends who don't care about dirt or vaults. She pointed a trembling finger at the three of us. You'll be hearing from my attorneys. By the time I'm done, you'll be the ones with nowhere to go. She turned and stormed toward her car, her white heels clacking against the gravel. We watched as she sped out of the gate, leaving a cloud of dust behind her. Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath and slumped against the side of the loading dock. She's not going to stop, Cassidy. You know that. She'll burn the whole world down before she admits she lost. Let her try, I said, looking at the black ledgers in my arms. She was playing a game of checkers, but Dad? He was playing for keeps. And he left us the map to the battlefield. Julian looked at the sunrise, then at the two of us. It's going to be a long month, Cassidy. But you have the land. Now, we just have to make sure she doesn't take the heart of the business with her when she flees. As the auctioneers began to pack up their things and the movers left the yard, I looked at the crane, the machines, and the blueprints. We had the evidence, we had Marcus back, and we had the ground beneath our feet, but as I remembered the look in Sloane's eyes, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the declaration of war. And the most dangerous part of a cornered predator isn't its bark, it's the desperate, final strike. I gripped the blue folder tighter. I was a science teacher, I knew that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And Sloane's reaction was about to be an explosion none of us were truly prepared for. The dust from Sloane's departure hadn't even settled before Julian gestured for us to get into his car. "This isn't the place for a reunion," he said, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the construction yard where several of the workers were still whispering and staring at us. "Sloane has eyes everywhere. We go to my office. Now." I helped Marcus into the back seat. He looked thin, his skin a sallow shade of gray that made my heart ache, but his eyes were sharper than they had been in years. I sat beside him, clutching the black ledgers and the blue folder like they were the only things keeping me tethered to the earth. As we pulled away from the gates of Vance Construction Group, I looked back at the massive cranes and the stacks of steel beams. This place had been my father's pride, but under Sloane's hand, it had become a fortress of secrets. "How did she do it, Marcus?" I whispered as we drove. "How did she get you to go to that place?" Marcus looked out the window, a bitter smile touching his lips. "She didn't use force, Cassidy. Not at first. She used Dad's death. She told me I was having a breakdown, that the grief was making me unstable. She started putting something in my tea, sedatives, I think. Then she had a doctor, a friend of hers, sign papers saying I was a danger to myself. By the time I realized what was happening, I was in a wellness retreat in the mountains with no phone, no internet, and guards who were paid to keep me safe from the world." My grip tightened on the ledgers. "I called you 100 times. She told me you were traveling in Europe, that you didn't want to talk to me because I was judging you for your lifestyle." "Classic Sloane," Julian muttered from the driver's seat. "Divide and conquer. If she kept you two apart, she could pick you off one by one. She needed Marcus out of the way because he was the only one who had the passwords to the company's offshore accounts, and she needed you gone because you were the only one with the moral backbone to ask where the money was going." When we arrived at Julian's office, he didn't take us to the main lobby. We went through a side entrance and into a room that looked more like a vault than an attorney's workspace. Thick mahogany walls, no windows, and a heavy steel door. "Okay," Julian said, sitting behind his desk. "The auction is stopped for now, and the trust is frozen. But Sloane is going to file an emergency injunction within the hour. We have a very small window to find the enforcement clause Arthur told me about." He looked at me. "The sealed envelope, Cassidy. Open it." My hand shook as I broke the wax seal. Inside wasn't a bank statement or a deed. It was a single, handwritten letter on my father's personal stationery and a small, silver thumb drive. "My dear Cassidy," the letter began, the familiar scrawl of my father's handwriting bringing a lump to my throat. Asterisk, if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. It means my eldest daughter has allowed her ambition to eclipse her humanity. I loved Sloane, but I saw the darkness in her long ago, the same darkness that took my own father. I tried to guide her, but some foundations are poured crooked from the start. You are a teacher, Cassidy. You understand that some things cannot be unlearned. I left you the house and the land not just for your security, but because they hold the key to the business's survival. Go to the basement of the old farmhouse. Under the third joist near the furnace, you will find a small iron box. The contents of that box, combined with the data on this drive, will prove that Sloane hasn't just been stealing, she's been sabotaging. Asterisk. I looked up at Julian, my breath hitching. Sabotaging? Why would she sabotage her own company? Because she's not running a construction company, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. She's running a liquidation scheme. Julian, did you look at the recent contracts for the City Bridge project? Julian nodded. The city pulled the contract last week citing safety concerns. That's why Sloane was auctioning off the equipment. She said the company was insolvent. It's not insolvent. Marcus stood up, pacing the small room. She intentionally used substandard materials on that bridge. She diverted the high-grade steel funds into a private account in the Cayman Islands, replaced the materials with cheap alloys, and then tipped off the inspectors herself. She wanted the company to fail so she could claim a massive insurance payout, sell the assets, and walk away with $80 million while the Vance name was dragged through the dirt. She was going to let the company die so she could live like a queen. The room went cold. I thought of the science lessons I taught my students about structural integrity, how a single flaw in the foundation can bring down a skyscraper. Sloane was the flaw. She was the rod in the beams. If that bridge had been built with those materials, I whispered, people would have died. She didn't care, Julian said grimly. She just wanted the cash. But she didn't realize Arthur was onto her. He must have been documenting the material swaps. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number. I answered it on speaker. I hope you're enjoying your little victory, Cassidy. Sloane's voice came through, cold and sharp as a razor. She sounded different. Gone was the polished CEO, replaced by something jagged and desperate. But you should check the news. And then you should check your email. What did you do, Sloane? I demanded. I did what a leader does. I trimmed the fat. By the way, I just had a very interesting conversation with the superintendent of your school district. It seems there's a rumor going around that a certain science teacher has been stealing lab supplies to manufacture illegal substances. There's a police car on its way to your classroom right now to search your desk. And since I'm the one who found the evidence and reported it, well, I don't think you'll be teaching much longer. Or staying out of jail. I felt the blood drain from my face. You're lying. I've never stolen a thing in my life. Doesn't matter if it's true, Sloane hissed. It matters what people see. You tried to take my company, so I'm taking your life. You have 1 hour to hand over those ledgers and sign the house back over to me, or I'll make sure you spend the next 10 years in a cell next to the criminals you're so fond of. The line went dead. She planted evidence at the school, I gasped, looking at Julian. She's going to destroy my career. She knows I'd do anything to keep my teaching license. She's desperate, Julian said, grabbing his coat. She knows those ledgers are her death warrant. She's trying to force a trade. Your freedom for her crimes. No, Marcus said, stepping forward. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the brilliance that had made him my father's favorite protégé. She made a mistake. She thinks you're just a teacher, Cassidy. She thinks I'm just a broken junkie. She forgot that we're Vances. He turned to Julian. How long to get to the farmhouse? 20 minutes if I drive like a maniac, Julian replied. Do it, Marcus said. Cassidy, call the principal. Don't defend yourself. Just tell him you're on your way with your attorney and that you want the police to seal the room until a third-party forensic team arrives. Use the science, sis. If she planted something, she left her DNA on it. She's sloppy when she's angry. The drive to the farmhouse was a blur of screeching tires and frantic phone calls. I did exactly what Marcus said. I called my principal, Mr. Henderson. He sounded disappointed, even hurt, but when I told him I was bringing a high-profile attorney and demanded a forensic seal on the room, his tone shifted. Cassidy, if you're innocent, this is a very bold move, he said. I'm not just innocent, Mr. Henderson. I'm being framed by the person who is currently dismantling the Vance Construction Group. Don't touch anything in that desk. I'll be there in 2 hours. We arrived at the farmhouse, my house, to find the front gate torn off its hinges. Sloane's thugs had already been there. The front door was hanging open, and the living room had been tossed. Furniture was overturned, and my father's favorite armchair had been slashed to ribbons. They were looking for the box, I whispered, stepping over a broken lamp. They won't find it, Julian said, heading for the basement. Arthur was a structural engineer. He didn't hide things in walls. He hid them in the architecture. We descended into the dark, damp basement. The smell of earth and old oil filled the air. Julian led us to the back, near the massive iron furnace that looked like a sleeping beast. He pointed to the third joist, a thick beam of oak that supported the kitchen floor above. Marcus grabbed a crowbar from a nearby workbench. With a grunt of effort, he wedged it into a seam in the wood that I had never noticed in all the years I'd lived there. With a crack, a false panel of wood popped loose, revealing a cavity. Inside sat a small, heavy iron box. I pulled it out, my heart hammering against my ribs. We opened it right there on the basement floor. Inside were the original shipping manifests for the bridge project. But more importantly, there were photographs. Photos of Sloane standing at a midnight meeting with a man I recognized, the head of the city's inspection bureau. In the photos, she was handing him a thick manila envelope. Bribery, Julian breathed. That's the enforcement clause. It's not just embezzlement. It's racketeering and public corruption. Wait, Marcus said, pointing to the bottom of the box. There's more. Under the manifests was a second sealed envelope, smaller than the first. It was addressed to Sloane. Should we open it? I asked. No, Julian said, his eyes hard. We saved that for the finale. Right now, we have a school to save and a sister to stop. As we climbed back up the stairs, my phone rang again. It was the school. Ms. Vance, Mr. Henderson said, his voice trembling. The police are here. They found a bag of white powder in your bottom drawer. They're taking it for testing, but the media is already at the front gate. How did they get here so fast? Sloane called them, I said, my voice cold and steady. Mr. Henderson, tell the police to check the security footage from the hallway between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. And tell them I'm coming with the evidence that will put the person who planted that bag behind bars for life. I looked at Marcus and Julian. The fear that had been suffocating me for days finally vanished, replaced by a crystalline, cold rage. My sister had taken my father's money. She had taken my brother's freedom. She had tried to take my career. But she had forgotten one thing: a Vance never stops building until the job is done. Julian, I said, stepping into the sunlight. Call the district attorney. Tell him we have the manifests for the city bridge. And tell him we're going to need a lot of handcuffs. As we piled into the car, I looked at the silver thumb drive in my hand. I knew what was on it. It wasn't just data. It was the blueprint for Sloane's destruction. She thought she was playing a game of power, but I was a scientist. I knew that when you put too much pressure on a flawed structure, it doesn't just bend. It shatters. And I was about to apply the final pound of pressure. The police didn't have to look hard. When I arrived at the school with Julian and Marcus, the officers were already reviewing the footage I had requested. There, in graining black and white, was Sloane. She hadn't even worn a disguise. Her arrogance was her blind spot. She truly believed she was untouchable. Seeing my sister slip into my classroom at 3:15 a.m. to plant evidence was the final heartbreak, but it was also my liberation. The officers took my statement, but I told them to hold the arrest for 1 hour. I wanted to be the one to hand her the truth. We drove straight to the Vance family estate. Sloane was in the study, pouring a glass of our father's expensive scotch, looking like she had already won the world. When she saw us walk in, Marcus looking strong, Julian holding the iron box, and me with a look of absolute fire, she didn't even flinch. Back for more, Cassidy, she sneered. I heard the police were looking for you. You should be careful about who you call sister when you're a disgraced felon. The police are looking for someone, Sloane, I said, walking right up to the mahogany desk. But it isn't me. Julian stepped forward, laying the shipping manifests and the bribery photos on the desk. Sloane's face went from pale to ghostly white in seconds. Her hand trembled, the scotch splashing over the rim of the glass. That's old news, she stammered. It's racketeering, Marcus interjected, his voice deep and steady. And Dad knew. He didn't leave you the company to reward you, Sloane. He left it to see if you'd fix the rot you started. You didn't. Julian then pulled out the final sealed envelope. The one addressed to Sloane. He left this for the moment you finally went too far, Julian said, sliding it toward her. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten letter from Arthur Vance. I watched her eyes dart across the page, her breath hitching. The letter revealed that Arthur had set up a judgment trust. If Sloane ever attempted to legally or criminally harm her siblings, her entire inheritance, every penny, the house, and her shares in the firm, would be immediately liquidated and transferred into a scholarship fund for my science department. Arthur had known his eldest daughter's nature all along. He had given her a chance to be better, but he had built a structural failsafe in case she collapsed. "You're broke, Sloane," I whispered. "And the district attorney is waiting in the driveway." As the handcuffs clicked into place and the police led her away, the weight that had been crushing my chest for weeks finally lifted. I looked at Marcus, and for the first time in years, we both felt the strength of the Vance name, not through money, but through the integrity our father tried so hard to protect. I went back to my classroom the next day, not as a suspect, but as a woman who had proven that the strongest structures aren't made of steel or stone, but of truth. If this story reminded you that justice eventually finds its way home, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you've handled betrayal in your own life. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of courage and the power of the truth. Thank you for watching, and remember, never stop building your own foundation of integrity. See you in the next story.